Welcome to today's deep dive on the paradox of temporary protected status, or TPS. We will explore how a designation intended to be temporary can stretch over decades, why that creates legal and ethical tension, and what practical steps people can take. To set the stage, we'll define TPS, discuss the core contradiction in the word temporary, and walk through the legal mechanics of termination. Then, we will confront the scale and ethical dilemmas, compare policy choices, and finish with concrete advice and key takeaways. Let's begin. Here's our roadmap. First, we define TPS. Next, we analyze the core contradiction between temporary intent and long-term reality. Then, we review how termination decisions legally work. After that, we examine the scale and ethical dimensions. Moving forward, we share an action plan for those affected. We'll also test your knowledge with a couple of quick quizzes. Finally, we close with key takeaways and a summary. Temporary protected status is an immigration designation provided by the United States to nationals of countries experiencing unsafe conditions, such as armed conflict, environmental disaster, or other extraordinary circumstances. TPS offers protection from removal and the ability to apply for work authorization. It is designed to be a short-term, humanitarian safeguard. However, through repeated extensions or redesignations, it often lasts far longer than initially envisioned, sometimes spanning decades, and allowing people to integrate deeply into American communities. Now let's turn to the core contradiction. TPS is supposed to be temporary, but in practice it can be renewed for 10, 20, or even 30 years. As a result, many people build stable lives, working, buying homes, marrying, and having U.S. citizen children. Critics argue that this long duration contradicts the plain meaning of temporary, and that the law requires termination when conditions materially improve. Supporters respond that in many countries, instability and danger persist in waves, justifying continued extensions on humanitarian grounds. This tension between statutory temporariness and real-life permanence sits at the heart of the debate. This flowchart maps the life cycle of TPS. It begins with unsafe conditions abroad that trigger a designation by the Secretary of Homeland Security. Beneficiaries apply and receive protection and work authorization. Periodically, DHS reviews country conditions. A key decision point determines whether conditions remain unsafe. If yes, the program may be extended or redesignated. If no, DHS publishes a termination notice in the Federal Register. By law, termination cannot take effect earlier than 60 days after publication, or the end of the current extension period, whichever is later. After the effective date, individuals face choices: leaving the United States, seeking other immigration avenues, or potentially becoming involved in litigations. This cyclical review and decision process is what sustains TPS over time, or brings it to an end. Let's discuss termination mechanics. Ending TPS for a country is not automatic. The Secretary of Homeland Security must formally assess whether the conditions that justified TPS no longer exist. If the decision is to terminate, DHS publishes a notice in the Federal Register. Importantly, the termination cannot take effect earlier than 60 days after publication, or the end of the current extension period, depending on which is later. This ensures a minimum lead time and provides a structured, legally grounded process. This table summarizes the rulebook. First, DHS assesses country conditions. Second, DHS publishes a notice in the Federal Register if termination is chosen. Third, there is a required period before the termination takes effect, either at least 60 days after publication or until the end of the current extension. Fourth, beneficiaries should monitor work authorization guidance, as documentation and validity dates can be affected. Finally, individuals should evaluate post-termination options, such as family-based or employment-based immigration pathways, by consulting qualified legal counsel. The scale of TPS communities is vast, often involving hundreds of thousands of people across many years. Many have U.S. citizen children, careers, and mortgages. This raises a difficult ethical question. Is it more harmful to terminate TPS and disrupt lives, or to extend a temporary status for decades without offering stability? Some argue that the real failure rests with policymakers who continue executive extensions without enacting legislative solutions, creating long-term uncertainty and the risk of sudden disruption when termination finally arrives. Here we compare two perspectives: On the left, termination advocates argue that ending TPS sooner preserves the integrity of a temporary designation, prompting return once conditions improve and preventing gradual policy drift. On the right, extension supporters emphasize protection during ongoing danger, minimizing family separation and community disruption, and allowing more time for Congress to craft durable solutions. The tension highlights why many call for legislative reform to reconcile humanitarian needs with legal clarity. This timeline depicts a generic, multi-decade TPS trajectory. At year 0, TPS is designated because of unsafe conditions. By year 2, an extension is issued. At year 5, danger continues. At year 10, beneficiaries have significant community integration. By year 15, DHS conducts another review. At year 20, policy debate intensifies, reflecting the tension between humanitarian protection and legal temporariness. Around year 22, DHS publishes a Federal Register termination notice. The law requires at least 60 days before the termination can take effect, or until the end of the current extension period. By year 25, termination becomes effective, and individuals must consider alternative legal pathways or departure. Here is a practical action plan. First, confirm your country's TPS status using official USCIS and DHS sources. Second, schedule an early consultation with a qualified immigration attorney. Third, map potential alternative pathways, such as family-based petitions, employment sponsorship, or other humanitarian options. Fourth, assemble essential documents, including identification, entry records, tax returns, and employment verification. Fifth, coordinate with family members and employers to manage timing and contingencies. Sixth, monitor the Federal Register and USCIS updates for termination notices and employment authorization guidance. Finally, prepare multiple plans to handle different outcomes. Important disclaimer. This content is for educational purposes only and does not constitute legal advice. Immigration laws and policies can change, and facts vary by individual case. You should consult a qualified immigration attorney to obtain advice tailored to your circumstances. Turning to policy insight and advice, executive extensions alone cannot permanently resolve the contradiction at the heart of TPS. Legislative action by Congress is necessary to create clear, stable pathways. Individuals should prepare for possible termination even while extensions are in place. Temporary remains temporary as a matter of law. Seek tailored legal strategies, including family-based, employment-based, or other humanitarian options, and proactively build your documentation file. Additionally, civic engagement matters. By communicating with elected representatives and sharing data and stories, communities can support efforts toward a durable legislative framework. The central point bears repeating. Temporary means temporary, even after many renewals, so legal and family planning should begin early. Quiz time. The question is, who has the authority to terminate a country's TPS designation? The options are A. The Secretary of Homeland Security, B. the U.S. Congress, C. state governors, or D. the Supreme Court. You may pause the video now to think about the answer. We will discuss the answer in the next section of the video. The correct answer is A. the Secretary of Homeland Security. The Secretary evaluates country conditions and, if warranted, publishes a termination notice in the Federal Register. The effective date cannot be earlier than 60 days after publication or the end of the current extension, whichever is later. Here's the second question. After a termination notice is published in the Federal Register, when can TPS end at the earliest? The options are A. immediately, B. 30 days later, C. 60 days later or at the end of the current extension, whichever is later, or D. 180 days later. You may pause the video now to consider your answer. We will discuss the answer in the next section of the video. The correct answer is C. By law, TPS cannot terminate earlier than 60 days after publication of the Federal Register notice or the end of the current extension period, whichever occurs later. This rule provides a minimum window before the termination takes effect. Let's recap the key takeaways. TPS is temporary as a matter of law. Termination requires a DHS review of country conditions and formal notice in the Federal Register. The termination cannot take effect earlier than 60 days after publication or the end of the current extension period. Long-term extensions create serious ethical and policy dilemmas by fostering deep integration under a temporary designation. Durable stability requires legislative solutions. Individuals should plan early, consult with qualified counsel, and maintain thorough documentation. In summary, TPS provides vital humanitarian protection, but breeds tension when it extends over many years. Termination follows a structured legal process, including notice and minimum timing. The ethical question is not simply whether to end or extend, but why long extensions persist without legislative permanence. Ultimately, legislative action is essential, while individuals should plan proactively with professional guidance. Thanks for watching. If you found this helpful, please like, share, and subscribe. Tell us in the comments what you think. Is the greater harm in ending TPS or in extending it without a path to permanence? Your perspective helps shape future discussions.